Got a request from someone in the comments, I think on the part 2 video, to just kind of go over trace supply sources, stuff like that. And I'd be happy to do that. So I'll do it real quick. Basically, the way supply works in OCS, there are two types of supply. There's on-map supply, which are the tokens that you can see here. These are used for fueling motorized units and for in combat fighting, basically. Units also have what's called internal stocks, where if they are going to fight and they are not within range of an on-map supply token, they can put a marker on them, as I think I showed it earlier, and they can fight, and they get a low supply marker, and then they can do that one more time to exhaust their internal stocks, and after that they'll fight at half strength. So that's on-map supply, and on-map supply functions in that way, and it also functions similarly to trace supply, which is what you would see in most war games. That's the second kind of supply, and that is units have to be able to trace a supply path back to a supply source in the supply phase, which comes after movement. So on your turn, you're going to move all your units and then check to make sure that they're still in supply. So the basic rules for supply is that, and each game and scenario will tell you what specifically is a overall supply source for your side. So in Sicily, it is ports. For the allies, it is ports that have a capacity of at least one supply point or more. So as long as units and stuff can trace back to a port that is one supply or more, they will be in trace supply during the supply phase. That is why it has been important for the allies to repair all of these ports. Port Empedokle, you know, they're repairing Marsala over here. If they can get that, then it frees up their supply situation. For the Axis, it's the same. And if they can trace back to one of the ferry hexes that connect mainland Italy to Sicily. And that is why it is important that they make sure their ports get repaired if they are damaged. As you can see here, Palermo is fully damaged. It no longer serves as a supply source. That's going to be a major problem for a lot of these units. The other supply sources in the game are going to be detrainable hexes, which I've already gone over. That's a hex with either an HQ, a railroad hex specifically, with an HQ or a town or village like this one up here. And that essentially means that if you can trace back to that hex, and that hex is on a rail line, that rail line can trace back to whatever the overall supply source is. In this case, the Axis is probably going to be using that right now to trace back to the ferry hexes up here. And the same is true down here on the coast, given the damage their ports have sustained. So it's going to be really important for the Allies to really cut this rail line if they can, like I've said. Now, there's this concept of an HQ throwing supply. So the normal default range that a unit can trace to either grab tokens from the map or be in trace supply after their movement is 5 motorized movement points. There's 3 types of movement in the game. There's foot, so anytime this right-hand number is white, it's a foot movement. They don't need fuel to move, they're walking. There's tracked movement, which is these yellow box numbers. They do need fuel, so whenever they want to move, any unit with a yellow tracked movement type needs to spend, well, I'll keep it simple. They need to spend 1 token of supply, so 1/4 of a supply point in order to move every turn, right? That's why supply is so important. You can't move your motorized units without fueling them up. And so if they can trace back to an on-map token, that's at least 5 truck movement points away, and truck movement is going to be denoted, like you see here, movement point with a black number. And a lot of mobile infantry, headquarters, trucks, all of them, they use truck movement. You need to be able to trace 5 truck movement points back to the supply source you're trying to draw from, either for trace supply to a detrainable hex or a port, or if you're fighting or trying to move to a supply token. Okay, and that just sort of abstracts that these invisible truck units that are kind of moving back and forth and getting supply, basically. So if this unit needs to draw from the supply that's here, there's this abstracted truck that's essentially driving back and delivering them what they need. So that's it. So you may be asking, well, if it's only 5 truck movement points, how do you get all these units out of there? Well, that's where HQs come in. As you can see, there's terrain on the map, right? So each type of movement costs a different amount to move through each type of terrain, and truck movement is the least efficient type of movement in the game. It is heavily dependent on roads like these or highways. Those are really going to dictate the way that you can get supply forward. And if you don't sort of maintain control of those things, it's going to be very difficult, because truck movement points are the worst type of, most inefficient type of movement. So HQs, that's where those come into play. On this HQ, you can see this 14 number. That is the range at which this HQ can throw supply to units via truck movement points. So this headquarters right here, When it comes to trace supply, after a unit has moved and needs to trace back to a supply point, this guy up here, for example, he is way more than 5 truck movement points away from the closest normal supply point for the Allies, which is this port right here. So how is he getting that supply? After he moved, how is he maintaining supply? Well, he's maintaining supply because this HQ itself is in supply. It is at the port of Licata, and of course, Licata has 2 SP of capacity, so that means it is an overall supply source for the Allies. That HQ is in supply there, and then it is throwing that supply forward up to 14 truck movement points to this unit here. So if we trace it out, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that unit is in supply because this HQ is throwing it to him. And this process works for tokens on the map as well. So if this unit needs to fight, it can be thrown supply from this headquarters unit. This headquarters unit sitting on a bunch of supply right now can simply spend that supply as if this unit were within range to draw from it because this HQ is throwing it forward. So I know that seems a little complicated. I know that it seems like you're doing a lot of calculations, but it gets second nature as you play the game pretty quickly. This map in particular has a lot of different types of terrain, so it may be a little more involved on this particular game, but a lot of East Front games have just lots of wide open, clear terrain. So you're not really worried about that so much because it becomes second nature for you to calculate the distances. But it does mean that your HQs are super important, and setting up your supply network across your forces is really going to make or break your game. You can see that I put an HQ over here for the Americans as well. Remember, that shipped in down over here. And the reason I did that was because all these units operating in here needed a place to be able to get their supply. And this unit here in this port is able to throw supply to them. So that's what's going on there. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I may be cheating a little bit now that I'm seeing this, because this port actually can't... yeah, this port is not a supply source for a lot of these units. So I may be cheating just a little bit here. I'm going to have to go and look at that. But as you can see, it's pretty easy when you're soloing such a massive operation to get some things wrong. I believe, let's see, 1, 2, let's see, Port Empedocle's down here. Yeah, I may be cheating a little bit up here. I may have to fix some things, or just kind of say that I screwed it up. But, that's the way the supply rules work. I hope that's helpful. I hope that kind of shows you the picture of what's going on. You know, sometimes you can make a mistake if you're not careful. I'm playing both sides, so it's a little taxing on the brain, but that's the way supply works. There's on-map supply for fighting and moving, and there's trace supply for making sure your units stay in supply and don't take penalties. Headquarters help with that. Their positioning is very important. So yeah, hope that helps. Okay, just a quick update. If I am correct, I looked at this situation. If I'm correct, and I think this is what I thought of before, but I believe that the Castle Vetrano town here on this railroad is a detrainable hex, and I believe Mazzara del Vallo is also a detrainable hex, and I believe Marsala itself is also a detrainable hex, and I believe that means that trace supply can be traced along this railroad all the way down to either Port Empedocle or Licata or Port Empedocle. I've been saying that probably wrong the whole game. But I believe as long as these rail lines are controlled, at least to here, I believe these units are in supply as long as they can trace within 5 truck points to a detrainable hex, or at least this HQ can. So I think I'm okay, but if I've got that wrong, let me know, because I would have seriously screwed up the campaign over here by cheating heavily. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled updates. We are at the end of turn 5, moving into turn 6. Fighting on Sicily has been going on for 2 weeks now, and I think the Axis is pretty happy with the defense they've managed to put up so far. As you can see, tons of reinforcements pouring down from Messina. They've crossed the straits, come down the highway, and are just making life miserable for the Commonwealth, completely clogging up this advance into Catania. And honestly, the Germans do appear to have sort of the upper hand in terms of units, unit strength, unit quality. The British, again, struggling with the supply situation. They really can't make a breakthrough anywhere in here. You know, they made that one here, but they've still got to cross this river, which runs right down the side of the front, or right down the middle of the front, I should say. And so it's been pretty tough sledding for the Commonwealth. You know, the naval bombardment has been useful, but it hasn't. Naval bombardment's unlikely to cause casualties, and the British don't have the supply really anymore to fire tons and tons of artillery. As you can see under this stack, there's just huge amounts of artillery, but it's so expensive to fire. And even if they do succeed in DGing these units, there's still a river crossing that's having the Commonwealth forces attack strength. So all in all, really slow going. The Germans this turn did pull back behind this river. They had moved down into here to kind of threaten the flank, but there's a reason they did that, and that is because things are looking pretty thin over the rest of the island, both from a positional standpoint and a supply standpoint. The Americans have made pretty good progress pushing up these roads. They've managed to drive back a bunch of these forces. This Ranger unit actually made a sort of a run up this road, mountain road here, to threaten a supply depot. So the Germans and Italians had no choice but to come back. Otherwise, they were going to be cut out of supply. And in general, this railroad line that connects east and west here is extremely important for them to defend. So they had to consolidate their perimeter a little bit and give up some ground to get into better defensive positions and also to protect their supply lines. There's been a lot of trucks and carriages and donkeys, as you can see, going back and forth from the coast inland because at this point, with the bombing of Palermo and Trapani, there hasn't been a ton of supply for the Axis up here. And so, like I said, it's getting very thin. So they're having to make supply runs to the coast, especially Messina being the main supply source. They can bring in 3 supply points a turn up here. And so they've been trying to shuttle that down to get it into position where it can be used. Over in other parts of the map, again, the Allies, or the Americans specifically, making pretty good progress. In the west, they did manage to dislodge the Italian unit that had been in Trapani over here, so they have control of that port now, and that's really important because with control of Trapani and Marsala, they can now start entering naval transport from this hex here, and that could allow them to do some sort of beach landing, or even just drop some units in to put some pressure on behind the lines. So the Italians, sort of in the west, have really pulled back pretty far. They're going to make sort of a last stand at Palermo. Again, the Axis don't need those units to live, really. They just need them to slow the Americans down. And the Americans, for their part, are going to start consolidating their forces. They're not sort of like spidering out into different tendrils and different sort of operations around the western part of the island. They have that pretty much under control. They're going to take out this coastal unit pretty easily on their next turn, and then it's going to be, the push is going to be on to Palermo. And because of that, and because of the progress that they've made up here, sort of over in this part of the island where there's a lot of crossroads, some of these units here in this division had to pull back just to make sure that they weren't going to be cut out of supply. Again, this Italian HQ is supplying a lot of these units in this area, and this Italian HQ is also drawing supply along these rail lines. So while it does look like the Axis should be able to sort of put on sort of an offensive posture, they really can't afford to get too far forward and overextended, because if they do, a lot of these mobile 2nd Armored Division units are just going to roll right through and cut supply for them. So they're trying to keep the supply network intact because that's going to provide the most effective resistance as possible. They also are running out of supply, like I mentioned. Palermo is, what is it, 2T? 2T is coming in via Palermo every turn. That is not nearly enough, and losing the supply point here in Trapani is going to really hurt. They took a chance and they fired off this giant artillery stack here, this Italian artillery and this German artillery managed to DG and put a hit on this unit here. This American division, which is going to slow down that advance. But in general, the Axis is kind of feeling the squeeze a little bit, so they're going to definitely make it as hard as possible for the Americans to get any momentum going. On the air front, the Axis actually, they've left a couple air units available in case they don't win initiative on this turn, but they spent a lot of time. The Allies had exhausted most of their bombers on their turn, and had actually exhausted a lot of their air superiority aircraft as well on their turn, and that left a couple big holes in the air network that the Germans decided that they were going to go all in on and actually try and attack the U.S. fleet that was off the coast of the island. And they actually successfully destroyed a destroyer group with a bunch of Junker 88s. That, again, victory points for the Axis at the end of the game. So pretty devastating. Despite all the flack in here, the Germans basically said, we may never get a better opportunity than we have right now with the air network being down. So we're going to go ahead and throw in as much as we can against that destroyer fleet, and knowing that they were going to take some losses, but hoping they could destroy some of those naval assets, and they did destroy a destroyer group. So that's going to reduce the Americans' shore bombardment abilities, but it's also going to give them points. So pretty nicely done by the Axis there. I say as if I am not playing them. And that's where we stand after 2 weeks on the invasion of Sicily. I think right now I would rather be the Axis than the Allies, but that could change very quickly. We're about to do the initiative for next turn. So again, let's roll that up. You can see the dead piles there. This big stack right here, lots of Axis aircraft in there. That's basically the entire starting Axis air units have just been destroyed essentially by overwhelming Allied air power. So let's do the initiative. Colored is the Axis. Okay, the Allies win it. So there's a real consideration here in terms of the Allies. They've been alternating back and forth the last couple of turns. The Allies probably don't want to let the Axis go first to restore their air power again while they have their air network down. That would probably be a bad idea, but they really want to threaten a double turn at some point. Now is probably not the time, so we're going to have the Allies go first in turn 6 and see what happens after that. The other thing they're considering here too is that a lot of these reinforcements the Germans have sent down in the Mount Etna area are still on move mode side, so they're not as powerful. So if they're going to push across the river and get a foothold here, it's going to probably have to be now, otherwise they're going to squander that chance. So Allies are up first. They're going to have a lot of work to do, and again, supply really an issue for both sides at this point. So it's going to be whoever manages that better is going to probably come out ahead. Dead pile for the Germans so far this turn, not looking great. The Allies just launched a series of attacks where they had supply, and they did amazingly well with some surprise rolls. The British finally have been able to cross this river here, and this is a stack of armor, and they're about to get an exploit to run down this way and sort of try and overrun all of these units in the open, which is going to be very nasty for the Germans. They rolled a maximum surprise roll for the surprise. They rolled boxcars. They rolled boxcars and a 5 for the column shift, so that was pretty devastating. This unit here, these special forces overran some tanks that were stupidly parked in the mountains where they get 1/3 combat strength, force them back. That's going to allow the Allies to advance up this road even further and cut supply potentially for these Italians. The only real negative impact here was this stack of armor tried to push into this village here who was disorganized. There's an Italian unit under there, and he managed to repulse this entire stack of armor because of the terrain. So it caused a loss, and they had to back it up, and so we're going to have to rethink this situation here because this terrain is just really unfriendly. The one thing I also forgot to mention is last turn the British attempted a really aggressive naval landing up here, and they landed in this hex. They captured this airfield, and then a German armored car who was in reserve sped out here, overran them, basically forced them out. And so it was probably to the Commonwealth's strategic blunder maybe, although it would have been really nice to cut supply to all these units down here. They were wiped out, and so those special forces will not be coming back into the game. So not great, but it was worth a shot, I think, given how much difficulty they were facing. One thing that I do want to catch up on here really quick, and someone pointed this out in the comments, is I did cheat a little bit. So if you look over here at some of these multi-unit formations, so for example, this one here, they're not all coastal defense units. As you can see, there's just a couple coastal defense units, 3 in there. When they surrendered, I mistakenly had the MG unit and the infantry unit surrender as well, and I think I did that for the red or yellow coastal defense formations as well. That shouldn't have happened. It's only the coastal defense units that surrender when you make the surrender roll. And so I pulled some units off the map that the Italians had sort of in the way. So it did make the initial advance from the landings for the Americans a little bit easier. I'm not going to try and go back and fix it at this point, but I did want to point it out because someone caught it, and I actually just caught it recently as well. So I did make it a little easier for the Americans. I guess you could say that I've also made it harder for the Americans because I'm playing with the optional rule with aircraft refit being only 1 plane per airbase level rather than 2. So they haven't been able to refresh their air power as much. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it probably would have altered the supply situation a little bit. Maybe the Americans wouldn't have been as far into the western edge of the island, but it's possible that those overruns that they would have made on those units would have been successful with surprise and would have given them exploits. So it's really hard to say, but I did catch it, and I did want to mention it in case you're watching these videos and you were watching the previous parts. The Americans did have a bit of an easier time sort of against the Italians on this side of the map for this particular game. Final tally after all the exploits are done. That is a lot of good German units, a lot. Especially ones that can't come back into the game with these little yellow efficiency or action ratings, I should say. That may have been a tipping point turn right there. I think as I'm looking at the Axis player and I'm looking at the victory point schedule for the number of steps that the Germans need to score victory points, that may have actually changed sort of their operational focus here with that many losses. It was just a super deadly turn for the Allies, extremely deadly turn. They made breakthroughs in a number of different sectors. And I'm thinking that if I'm the Axis, you know, we're on turn 6 right now, the Axis half of turn 6. I'm thinking that they're probably going to want to, at least with the German units, start to pull back pretty heavily and find the choke points to defend. So as I'm looking at the map, I think, you know, obviously Mount Etna is a huge choke point here if they can hold the coast. They don't want to take too many losses doing that. This river obviously is the last real majorly wide defensible terrain. As soon as they sort of back off of that, there's another river here they may be able to hold on to as this narrow road cuts up there around Mount Etna. But essentially, with the number of steps they have left on the map, they probably need to exit 80% of them in order to get a good VP score to try and win the game. I mean, it's going to be really tight. Certainly in here, the Hermann Goering Panzer division is reduced a ton. They lost 2 more units this turn. They're kind of spread out all over the place. They probably want to pull back pretty heavily. This particular division with the red stripe, they also probably want to pull back pretty heavily, especially now that they're sort of going to kind of be like hit on 4 particular points of attack now. And then some of these German units who came in to kind of reinforce, they probably want to get out of Dodge as well. I mean, you know, based on what's left on the map, it looks like the Germans probably have to exit most of those guys up here in order to score any sort of meaningful victory points. And there's not really, I mean, I think like the biggest choke point up here, you know, the Italians can defend Palermo, you know, but like there isn't really one that's easily defensible, really. I mean, they can kind of do a fighting retreat through this terrain on this highway, but if the Allies have sort of unfettered access up this coast, especially if these coastal units up here surrender, they can potentially reach Messina first, and the Axis definitely don't want that to happen. So they're in a tough spot. That Allied turn absolutely hammered them, and where they thought that they were in a good position, they are suddenly not. So some new considerations coming into play as I figure out what to do with the Axis. This is probably going to look very different by the time I come back. And as expected, the Axis retreat is on. They are just in a really untenable position that is going to lose them the game if they don't start backing off. So as you can see, they've ceded all of this interior ground to the Allies. The Germans are essentially trying to get out and get along, well, these Germans anyways, are trying to get out and get along this northern coastal road and railroad to stay in supply. And they're essentially going to be making their way back towards Reggio over here over the next couple turns. They've left the Italians to hold Catania, or excuse me, Palermo for as long as humanly possible. They've left some coastal defense units who we know are not going to surrender sort of in the way. They've still got a division here that's okay. They've got some not great units, some limited units. They moved their headquarters back to Palermo. They moved an aircraft to cover the city. They're basically going to try and make this as hard as possible for the Allies to take. Unfortunately, it is not a supply source for them until they start repairing it. So that's why they moved an HQ there. They just don't have the supply this turn, I don't think, to repair it. So they're in, well, they may have the supply to repair it. Let's see. They've got 1 token there. They could actually use this donkey. Let's do that now. They're gonna, this HQ, which was located here, I believe, half, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, he would have been able to take the supply. Sorry, he would have been able to take the supply from here. Messing this all up, I believe it would have been 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, he's in range. So he can repair Palermo to 1T, which he's going to have to do to make it a supply source. Because the other problem here is this railroad. If for some reason the Allies are able to cut this northern railroad with a ZOC or a unit, then the folks in Palermo are on their own, and they need the port to be a supply source for them to get supplied by sea, assuming they can last that long. It's very uncertain, although the terrain is good for them, so they're going to try and hold that as long as possible. Meanwhile, the Germans are going to back off. The same is true down over here. The Germans have consolidated their forces, and they are just piecing out. So the problem they have is that this east-west rail line is what was keeping them supplied, but the Allies have just threatened it in so many places here coming up, so they had to kind of stretch out along the rail line to guard the retreat. And over the next couple turns, they're going to leave these Italians to try and slow down the Allies in key positions. Meanwhile, they're going to make their way as quickly as possible to get within range of this HQ up here, who is also backed off because the fight was being taken pretty close to it near the city of Catania. Germans don't want to, they want to hold the port of Catania, but they don't want to hold it to their detriment. Like I said, they need to protect a lot of these units and get them off the map. It does feel a little early in the game for the Germans to have to shift to that posture, but that last Allied turn was just so destructive. So they're basically, in the next couple of turns, going to try and get these units as quickly as possible to the highway up the coast and sort of put up some defenses on Mount Etna, maybe leave a couple units here on the west side just to make sure the Allies don't have an easy end around. And all in all, over the next couple of turns, you're going to start to see the Germans specifically start to really move up towards the north end of Italy and hope that the Italians can hold. Again, the Italians have a division here who's pretty big strength, and, you know, some light armored or semi-armored units here. But, you know, there's just so much ground to cover, and those two units are going to be able to hold everything. So really, the Germans preparing their tactical withdrawal. They decided to move a bunch of units back across this side of the river here, just to make sure that that the Allies couldn't get to this railroad very easily. They've got sort of the strategic crossings covered, so it's going to be pretty difficult for the Allies to throw a ZOC. I think maybe the easiest hex will be here, which actually they will be able to cut that. So you know, there's not a lot the Axis can do to prevent that. Unfortunately, they just don't have enough units, and there's just too many Allies in sort of range of various threatening spots. I think maybe they might be safe from here because the HQs, I don't think this US HQ can reach that far. Actually, I might be able to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, I definitely can. Oh boy. So yeah, Axis in real trouble here. You know, I haven't maybe necessarily played them as well as I could have, but certainly it's a very challenging game for them anyways. They're also out of supply in a lot of these places. There's a small supply dump, a few supply dumps over here that the Italians can use. Most of the supply over on this theater is here. They just spent a bunch to bombard these two infantry divisions here. They were hoping for a step loss. They didn't get it, but it will slow down their advance. So yeah. So that's where we are. The tide has turned quite significantly, and it's going to really be a race now to see if the Axis can get off the island and keep the Allies at bay long enough to preserve their forces for the impending march up the boot. So here we are. Another just absolutely knockout turn for the Allies again here on the final turn of July, turn 7 of Sicily 2. You can see what the Allies lost, a couple armored units here, but the Italians and the Germans took a bunch, actually this is an Italian unit as well, took a bunch more losses that they really couldn't afford whatsoever. And these losses, when you combine it with the situation on the map, it is real ugly for the Axis right now, super ugly. A bunch of units over here out of supply. They were getting ready to sort of make an orderly withdrawal back up these roads to sort of consolidate around Mount Etna, like I said they would. Allied attacks really disrupted that plan. Actually, a great attack by this infantry division forced a huge stack of German units out into the wilderness, and they had to try and regroup and get out of there. Another armored unit from the Allies swung around on some of these roads, managed to displace some of the supply that these units had. So they're in just a really bad way. Some of the other ones managed to make it out, but again, they're still just sort of out in the middle of nowhere in no man's land over here around Mount Etna. The German HQ up here moved off of this road to get into a position where it could kind of supply around the mountain and protect itself. You had a couple of Italian infantry, one of those regiments, no, those are comp groups, move down from the north. But in general, the progress of the Allied attack, the Commonwealth attack down here, has caused all kinds of problems for the withdrawal. Units sort of in movement mode, in combat mode, mixed, not able to sort of regroup to the same hex. I will admit that I did not play the Axis very well setting up for this, but I also didn't expect the Allies to make such amazing headway 2 consecutive turns in a row. Really unpredictable results. I mean, the Allies got surprised again on almost every attack that they rolled. These dice are really feast or famine. And, you know, just in general, just this huge strung out thing. The Germans trying to keep the supply open so they can rescue this unit and maybe this unit over here on the next turn. They're desperate for a couple things. One, they're desperate for supply. There's just almost no supply left on the German side for any type of attacks. They've maintained a little bit under here for, you know, a defense if they have to make it. But, you know, a lot of these units are motorized or on the back side, and they just don't have the fuel. So they've been marching up the road on foot, trying to head back up here to safety. The Commonwealth now has suddenly found themselves across a bunch of river lines where there were defenders and now there are not. So they're going to be able to make a huge advance into here and try and come around. The Axis have left kind of a token defense at this river crossing to hope that they can just make it one more turn. The other thing the Axis is desperate for is initiative. They need to win initiative on this turn, because if they don't, the Allies are going to get to go and they're really going to disrupt this even further. It's real panic time for the Axis, got to be honest. As I kind of pull out here, you can see the amazing progress that the Allies have made on the last couple of turns, all the way down from the beach. They've freed up most of the middle of the map. The Axis is just in a horrible position. And then obviously over here, they've had a little bit easier time getting out of Palermo, coming up this northern road where there's not so much threat of Allied attack. Although, you know, we're getting into the position now where this division can go into move mode next turn and cruise up here and maybe put some pressure on. So the Axis have left sort of a token defense behind this river crossing with the hopes that you know, they can slow down the advance a little bit. The balance that the Axis is playing with here is this turn track over here. So there's a couple things that they are trying to do. One, they want to try and last. I mean, they still got 3 turns before they can even begin to think about scoring bonus victory points. And I don't know that they have the manpower to do it with the way the Allies are rolling right now. But they're trying. They're basically, you know, the old adage, trading space for time. The Axis have decided that they're going to be trading Italians for time in this particular scenario. As you saw the dead pile, a bunch of Italian units went down. Again, here in the port of Palermo, very key location. They've basically got 1 Italian infantry division who's damaged slightly. An anti-tank unit. What else do they got here? They got some big artillery. They just don't have the supply to fire it. The Germans did airdrop some supply into this airfield over here. There is a lone disorganized German Kampf group unit here on this airfield to try and slow the Allies down. And there's 1 damaged Italian fighter unit there that, I mean, you know, it's not going to be able to do much against the American Spitfires. It's just totally outclassed, but at least it's something. And the Italians basically trying to hold Palermo and Catania, for that matter, for 1 more turn. They've also got units over here in Catania. Catania is this hex here. They've got a German mobile infantry division and a coastal unit who may or may not surrender. But what they're thinking is, they don't want to lose units defending it, but what they're thinking is, if they can just last till the first turn in August, if they can prevent the Allies from taking those both in August, they will have robbed another victory point and gained one themselves from the Allies, which will be sort of the best possible outcome for what they've got right now. And if they can do that, then they can immediately pull back and try and hold some of these narrower approaches up here. And this is up in Messina is going to be a real war zone, because the terrain is really bad. There's not a lot of space. The Allies are going to have to get creative with what they do there. But if they can hold Catania and Palermo for 1 more turn, they can get a much needed point and then clear out, essentially. So they're going to put up as valiant a defense as possible here. The Allies are a little scattered around here, so they, you know, they're going to have to sort of consolidate on this next turn when they move up. They may not be able to overrun that stack. It might be just too big, but they are going to pile up for a big attack. And meanwhile, they're just cruising. They've got, you know, all of the advantage on their side. They've got the air power. They've got plenty of supply, and they can move it around now that they've brought some trucks onto the map via sea shipping. You know, they might even consider bringing the 2nd British HQ in now that there's going to be a nice push to get up here. So, Yeah, that's where we are. I'm getting the sense that the game is coming to a rapid conclusion with the sort of German withdrawal, but the Allies are happy to see it, and I would say that I've learned a lot by playing the Axis in this game. Were I to play it again, I would probably do things a little differently as the Axis. I would certainly be a little more conservative with my positioning, and I would have consolidated my forces in sort of places where if the worst comes to pass, they would not be hosed like they are now. Now, granted, the Allies had a lot of luck, but obviously, you know, I should have maybe foreseen that and been a little more conservative with my setup for the Axis. So that's where we are. We are going into the first turn of August, and I'm going to guess that the final video in this series will be the rest of the game. I'm going to try and make it so. I think you're going to see a lot of rapid movement and changing of board state really quickly, so I will check in after every turn, but it won't be quite as long. The narrative is sort of approaching its zenith, and you know, we'll have a winner here probably in the next couple turns, I think. I don't know if the Axis is going to be able to last 4 turns to get to at least a single victory point, but we'll see. Well, maybe an indication of a change in fortunes, but the Axis just rolled initiative for next turn, and they won it, and they are absolutely going to go first to try and shore up their positioning, so good news for them.